All right, man. Another very commonly asked question, whether it's in our comments, whether it's from students of ours, about should I work at a small startup or should I work at a very large company? I know we both had experiences at companies of all sizes. Definitely want to break that down, and not even better or worse per se, but some of the differences on the outside looking in that most aren't aware of. I'll kick it over to you for your thoughts, maybe set the agenda for us in true discovery call fashion.
Yeah. No, this I think this is probably the one that comes up the most, especially for students that end up having a lot of different opportunities. Once they get into the flow of everything, they're not going back and forth, right? Typically, smaller companies are going to offer more pay, so it's always a dilemma. I see it happening a lot, and so we've got kind of the way we're going to break this down is through criteria. So obviously, we could talk about this all day long. So we're going to kind of gate it into these subjects here. The first one's going to be pay, compensation, quota attainment, visibility into that. Second one's going to be upward mobility, growth opportunities at small startups versus large organizations. Third is going to be office politics, playing the corporate game, KPIs, all the good stuff, the fun stuff.
Yep.
From there, we'll go into onboarding and training, stability, high risk, high reward associated with going for a startup versus a large organization. And then last, work-life balance.
Yeah.
So maybe jumping into the one that probably everybody wants to know about is pay, compensation, and also quota attainment, everything under the sun as it relates to that.
Yeah, generally speaking, maybe as a starting point, I think what we have seen recently, at least, correct me if I'm wrong, generally speaking, the larger market leaders have paid a slightly higher OTE on average, but there have definitely been outliers in the startup space where we've seen some really high growth startups really particular about the types of talent they want. And if you can land there, you can land a 110, 125, maybe even 130 OTE SDR job. Generally speaking, maybe even taking a quick step back, using sites like RepView, trying to get a sense for attainment. We don't want to just sit here and give you the stat of the OTE is higher here or higher here. Very important when you're weighing a very common scenario. We'll have someone that gets an offer from MongoDB and it's 75K, but they have an offer from a very high growth startup that's 85 or 90K. There's no wrong answer per se. And I know we're going to talk about many of these other elements, but generally speaking, at Mongo, as an example, or a big name, a well-known name in the tech sales space, you're going to be closer to your target, but the range is going to be smaller. So you're probably going to hit 80 to 150% of your number. And at startups, again, there are very bad cases that happen. You're probably more likely to have a wider range of attaining 30 to 50%, up to 200+% if you're absolutely killing it and you join the startup at the right time where the market's insanely hot. Lots of more I could get into, but I'll pause for your thoughts as well.
Yeah, and I think there's different tiers of large organizations, there's different tiers of small organizations. So it's been a very interesting development over the last couple of years. Is everybody's kind of trying to balance things out, because there is a very unique breed of hyper growth startups. Obviously, my company Vanta is one of them. And the pay is very competitive. They actually make it a special point to pay much higher than the average because they're trying to attract the best talent in the world. Right? They're trying to get this talent from AWS, from Google, from these large FAANG companies over to them. And so I would say if you're going for the upper echelon of hyper growth startups, those will typically pay more. But I would say the average, if you're looking at the larger organizations, will pay more on average.
Yeah.
So very interesting development, because obviously to your point too, there's really good large organizations that will pay a lot, but then there's also really bad large organizations that have very immature sales organizations.
Yeah.
And vice versa too, with small startups. So it just depends, but I think for everybody else watching out there, remember that OT is just a number. Yep. So there's a lot more that goes into pay compensation than just that number that you're presented on that piece of paper. And I think a big value of going into a large organization, I actually prefer small organizations, but a big piece of the value of going into a larger organization is that you have data. You have a history of understanding and knowing to some degree, what am I actually walking into? Mm-hmm. Whereas with a smaller startup, you can get a number that says 125 or 130, which you typically will get because they know if you are a very hot candidate that you're probably talking to a really good company, a larger company. And so that's their way of kind of getting you in.
Yeah.
But if there's only 4 reviews on RepView, right, and there's barely any data on it, then it's it's hard to know. Whereas the other company that has 300 reviews on RepView, even if that average quota attainment is a little bit lower, the OT is a little bit lower, I would probably go for that.
Yeah.
So I think a very broad topic, but
yeah, and this will probably queue up the other topics too. It's really hard if you're excited, you do break in, you are finally in a sales role and thinking about all that upside. Like, this is a hard thing, and it's not a one size fits all rule, but it is funny. I would say there's never a time where salary means less as an SDR than any other point of your career, because there are times where, yeah, if you get the great offer with the highest salary, absolutely go for it. But in the example that I mentioned, if you have, 75K at an Oracle, at a MongoDB, at Salesforce, and you've got an 85 or 90K offer at a startup that's kind of like, honestly, 1 year of, on paper, having a lower OTE where you still have a better chance of over-attaining, and not to mention you get the brand name of a large company on your resume, it's really hard sometimes when you're right there and you have either the highest salary you've ever gotten, or you're just looking at a 15K difference and that seems monumental. It means nothing when you get 3 to 5 years in your career. So I'm sure it's all the points we're going to continue to break down. I think that was a good starting point, but this is the other things I'm going to look for as well.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I think a really cool example kind of ties in. It's like the perfect segue, but we had a student who was interviewing with ZoomInfo and with another company that was just like complete no name. Like it would literally be like second, nothing wrong with no name companies. I'm just saying, like, it requires extensive vetting. Yeah. And they were offering him 30K more than what ZoomInfo was offering him. And I remember just like going back and forth with him, and he fortunately made the right decision. Now he's working at AWS. He's making 160, I think, his like, I think he got there in like 6-9 months or something. Yeah. Because he was an absolute killer, absolutely crushed it. Yeah. But had he gone down the other path, I highly doubt that he would have ended up in the same situation. Yeah. And so I think it ties in directly into also like the upward mobility, the growth opportunities. Like, yes, to your point, when you attach yourself to a really good logo and you extrapolate your thinking outside of just me making 10K more in my first year, I think it's a lot more about like, how can I set myself up to maximize my earnings in year 2 and beyond? Yeah. Because like, if you can get to AE faster, that 10K is not gonna, even 20K, even 30K is not gonna matter at all.
100%.
So that's what I always try to tell people is like, what I look for beyond anything else, which is the next topic, is upward mobility and growth opportunities. Mm-hmm. And I think there's definitely value to being at like a really good company. The question is just how much upward mobility, how many growth opportunities do you have at those companies? Everything is a dilemma. Yeah. Right. And so I'll let you kind of take a little bit of this. I have a whole lot on this. So
for sure. I think a few data points just for everyone's reference. What you get with the potential stability and higher likelihood of at least hitting 100% of your number at a large company, you usually trade off for a more rigid and formalized promotion process. So whereas a startup, which we'll get into in a bit, if you're like the clear number one, you've got a lot of leverage to keep promoting. You have that at a bigger company, but usually you're going to get hit with like a standard minimum 12 to 18 months to promote, and there's really nothing they can do about it. So that is one trade-off. Again, I still think it's worth it if you like larger companies, and 2, I put it this way to most of our students, in 80+% of cases, if you get an offer at a very large company and you don't hate it, that's probably the best move, because even if you're locked in that 12 to 18 month process, ideally you at least spend 2 years at your first gig. But even if not, it is a lot easier to say, hey, I worked at Oracle and now go to a startup, than go to a startup where there's questionable experience that Oracle, as an example, may or may not value. So that's one element of it. Generally, safer pay, safer job overall, probably, slower promotion path. But again, attaching yourself to those years of experience at a market leader is very valuable. Yeah. Now, the flip side is on the startup side, I definitely benefited from that, if I'm being fully honest. I mean, I promoted from SDR to AE in literally 3.5 months. What I would say on the startup side, there's no any one of these things can happen that contribute to this. So certainly if you come in and absolutely crush it, the nice thing compared to a super large organization is you're going to get noticed rather quickly. And it doesn't mean you get promoted per se, but imagine if you go in and you hit 190% of your number at Oracle, but there's 3 other people that have hit 175%. It's great. It's great. Here's your gold star. That's great. But you're like, next quarter, if you finish at 175 and that other person finishes at 190, they're going to see that progression and not forget that you exist, but it's less noticeable. It doesn't stand out as much. On the startup side, yeah, like if you're hitting 190% your first couple of months in the role and you're outperforming people who have been there a year and a half, you now have a lot of leverage. And on top of that, one thing I benefited from, quite frankly, is in the startup space, you generally see people moving around more often. I mean, there's no hard and fast rule, but people are jumping from job to job every year or two. And that is something I benefited from. I performed exceptionally well as an SDR. We had a new team that they started to sell this new cloud product as account executives. The two people in front of me that they were going to promote, one decided that, you know, they didn't want an AE role. I digress. I'm not even going to get into that. But the other person left for another company, and they were like, you know what? You have 3 years of engineering experience. You've done nothing but like work your ass off since you've been here. You're already hitting quota. Like, I have no doubt you could excel in this role. And that's how I got promoted. And that there is like, I have no problem and shame being honest in this. Like, if I worked at Oracle or AWS, there's a 0% chance I'm promoting from SDR to account executive in 3.5 months. It just is what it is. So I definitely hand it to you for your thoughts as well.
Yeah. I mean, this entire discussion is about, you know, high risk, high reward. Like, that's really what it comes down to. So, you know, like, obviously we're breaking it down like individually so that you understand the different criteria that you kind of have to look into and think about, because some people might have a higher risk appetite in certain areas and the lower risk appetite in other areas, right? But yeah, like I think you summed it up pretty well. Like, I think that with smaller startups, and we're just going to assume that you are at actually like a growing small startup, because like if you're at a small startup that isn't growing, you're kind of just screwed no matter what. So like, for the sake of just like not having this be 3 hours long, this entire conversation or discussion is centered around like you actually doing the work up front, making sure that like this is a good startup, good product market fit, XYZ, and probably the same thing for that large organization, which they probably wouldn't be a large organization if they didn't have product market fit. But if you are at a fast-growing startup, yes, there will be more opportunity. There's more changes happening. And obviously, we'll get into stability, because obviously it's not just good things. That also comes with like a sacrifice in your work-life balance, XYZ. But I think if you are a little bit more okay with taking a risk, if you are, you know, the type of person who likes to kind of, you know, be measured like month over month, like I think the timeline also changes a lot. So instead of, you know, being able to chill for like a month and a half at a large organization, blend in with the rest of the team, have a more chill life, you know, like the startup might be better. And that's typically where the opportunity for upward mobility comes, right? Because if you actually, or if you actually do crush it and the company is growing, there's more teams opening up. There's a bigger need for like new products that are opening up. So like, there's always going to be opportunities, or I would say like more opportunities to move into like other fields or like other, you know, teams or whatever else. So if you are crushing it, yes, you have a faster path to promotion. But if you aren't crushing it, you might get canned. So very real thing happening there. I think that's pretty solid, like for that one. I think it just depends on like, if you want to take on more risk, sure, you know, you can do a startup, but also be ready for, you know, a short stint if you're not doing well. So maybe moving into the next one, which is sort of like stability. Just like, you know, like what are the implications of going to a startup from a stability perspective? Yeah,
I think even maybe on a personal level, right? Like job stability at a larger company, it's a little bit more cyclical. I'm not even, you know, pending, if you're at the right startup and you're doing well, like obviously you're fine. If you're at a large company and you're doing okay, it's a little bit more cyclical. Like end of year, we'll probably see some more layoffs come December, January timeframe this year, quite frankly, at very large companies. Whereas startups, it's just like one day everything's great. Tuesday, all right, sorry, like everyone's got a calendar invite. You don't know if you're on the layoff side. You don't know if you're on the safe side. And there's an announcement later in the day where everyone says like, take the rest of the day off. We're really sorry. We had to let go of 10% due to economic headwinds, all of these different things. So that's one piece of it. What's interesting too is I would say, like, I can't say this for everyone. There's no hard and fast rule, but I would generally say one thing to be aware of that I have seen is reps that spend significant amount of time at very large companies become a little bit like, if you spend 2 to 3 years at a market leader, maybe even 4, you can go to a startup that's of decent size. If you spend 10 years at Oracle, as an example, pure hypothetical, and you want to go to like a Series B startup, honestly, those companies actually kind of avoid reps like that, if I'm being honest. Because at that point, like all you've ever known is slow, steady process. You've known, all of these different things. And I'm sure there's exceptions to this rule, but it's very much, I mean, honestly, it's not too dissimilar from like an MBA working at some of these tech companies, where tech companies actively do not hire MBAs because all they've known is kind of institutionalized thinking to make an overgeneralization. And they've just known big process, big brand name. They've never had to fight as the non-market leader. And that's a very difficult skill to develop. So again, maybe outside of the specific, like you're hired, you're fired, stability, I think really just keep in mind, these different tracks give you different skill sets that you can leverage. And there's no right or wrong. For me, I love scrapping it out for a startup that's not a market leader or being in a niche space where you are a market leader. But if you're a market leader and you're a 10,000 plus person company, I don't really jive with all the process, and I respect that. And there's tons of like straight A students, like absolute killers over there. But those are some of the trade-offs I think about from a stability standpoint. So
yeah. And I think just like in terms of stability, like just be ready for if you are at a smaller company. And this isn't to say that this can't happen at large companies, because it definitely still can. And honestly, when it happens at large companies, it's of like kind of like a large magnitude. So like they might cut out like 3 teams or something like that. But it happens much less frequently, right? It's funny because I actually looked at the exact situation that you're talking about. Like I saw a lot of reps go from, I'm just going to say it, like they went from Gong to Tropic, for instance. And it's not just that situation, but I've seen other situations where, reps are like, there's this new hypergrowth startup, like they're growing really fast. The problem with that is that they don't have really like a track record of growing that fast. And so they think that now they need to hire to sustain that growth. And obviously if they take it on like venture capital money, there's an expectation to show to investors that like, hey, this is what we're doing to sustain this, not just sustain it, but actually increase it moving forward. And exactly to your point is when you don't have that history or track record of having growth like that, then who knows if it's sustainable, right? Like you might have like 3 to 6 months, especially if the company hasn't even been around for like 2 years, right? I mean, it's hard to know when that growth is going to stall or where the true product market fit is and where it fits in with the broader market. And so I think that's the trade-off that you have to be willing to take is, sure, you can have really, really high really, really high reward at a small company, but yeah, you could lose your job tomorrow. And some people thrive in that. Personally, I actually really, really like that because honestly, if you are a top performer and you're absolutely crushing it, they're probably going to move you around to a different team if you're really that valuable. So like if you are the type of person who just like is willing to put in the work like for the next 3 years, which everybody on paper says they are, by the way. But when they get into a really tough position, and there's lots of other factors too, like territory and all sorts of things that are outside of your influence and control, it becomes a whole different like game, so to say. So for sure. I think that's solid. And also like office politics. This is a big one. Probably the reason why I prefer small startups, to be honest. Well, not like completely small, but like this middle ground of like, I think, 100 to 500 is probably like the sweet spot for me. Is like there's just less politics. Like they're starting to get kind of flushed out, like they're creating their initial processes, but it's not to the point where like they're tracking down every single call, like tracking down like your call time on cold calls or how many emails that you're sending. Like the problem is like once companies grow to a certain size, like your boss has a boss, their boss has a boss, their boss, like, and it goes up like this, like until like there's like 11 or 12 layers. In the end, the only thing that essentially the CRO is looking at is, okay, what's the input that's required to generate this output? Cool. We need more emails, right? Okay, great. Like let's increase our reply rate. And so the problem is like all of that stuff in the middle is kind of lost in translation. And so you end up having these like administrative tasks or busy work where you just have to like send out 300 emails. And we all know that it's not 300 high quality emails that are being sent out every single week. A lot of it is literally just like, unfortunately, blowing up people that aren't really relevant inside of like sequences that don't even matter, that are created by people who have never blah blah blah. Anyway, very like I can talk about it. I can keep going on that. But the point I'm trying to make here is that there's a lot more busy work. There's a lot more things that like you're just fitting into a structure overall. There's not as much creativity to be part of like building out the initial processes and have the flexibility. So like if you are the type of person who is maybe a little bit more entrepreneurial, who is a little bit more creative, who wants to have a little bit more control over things and not just like fit into a little box, like that can also be nice for some people. But if you are the type of person who wants to be a little bit more creative with how you work, typically like big companies are not a good fit.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a few dynamics to keep in mind here. You know, if you are in a position where you're fortunate to have multiple offers, and we've kind of checked the boxes on all the things we've talked about so far, politically, I think you can ride waves at startups a lot more, and I'll explain what I mean. And conversely, at large companies, you've got to be aware of some common pitfalls. So, for instance, for me, I worked at a huge company as an engineer. I hated it. And I knew going into tech sales, I wanted to be in the startup space. So I did that. One of the biggest differentiators at the time was the manager that I was going to work for had an eerily similar background to me. And I could tell that he was like very sharp, very on, like someone I would learn a lot from and would actually put a ton of attention into coaching me as well. So not like I wanted my hand held, but I had met some other managers throughout the interview process. And I've mentioned this before that were like, more excited about like talking about golfing and I don't know, their watch collection and all this different stuff, and like just didn't like I don't know, it just wasn't the right fit. And so I will say, like, in that sense, if you can find the right manager at a small company, you can really ride that wave if they're highly respected. There's only 2-3 managers there, and you get a sense and you can figure out in the interview process that they're like the top team. You can ride that. The flip side is one thing to be aware of that's really hard to see on the outside looking in. I know we've actually had like several students break into AWS recently. When you're going to a very big company like that, and this happened at the engineering company I was at with 10,000 plus people, they generally hire in cohorts. And let's say, just for the sake of round numbers, every month they bring in 50 new SDRs. What you need to realize, you probably don't realize, is that very quickly throughout this training and onboarding process, there are teams that are subconsciously evaluating you, and they are trying to find the top 10 to 20% of people and put them on the best territory. So like by performing exceptionally well those first 3 months, you can really put yourself in a great position. And literally, if you did okay, but you weren't identified for whatever reason, you didn't mesh with a manager, or you didn't score, on the top percentile of their training, they literally will put you in a less recognizable territory. And this happens, and all of a sudden, like, you pretty much have equal ability to appear that, covers all of San Francisco for AWS, which is like every tech company in the world's headquarter, and you're covering Iowa, and all of a sudden on paper, you're doing way less, when there is something to be said about the territory that they get. However, you need to be aware of this and know what you're signing up for so you can optimize this game.
Yeah.
And that's the last thing I'd say about, I'll cut myself off here. If you want to explore these topics, we can. But I think the bigger you go, and some of the things you mentioned, the bigger of a company that you're at, the less you're directly in control of. And what happens is you almost have these like games within a game. So like if you're in an environment as an SDR where they're hiring lots of new college grads, everybody's friendly. It's a young, energetic environment, but also like most people are there to promote. And there's a lot of people that want to promote but aren't willing to put in the work to do that. And then because you have so many people, then it becomes like a lot of like the clickiness, the behind people's back and all that shit that is going to happen at any organization, but it's much more likely in these highly competitive environments at these entry-level positions where all the managers above you are like, we want to promote all of you by the end of 2026 and all these things, and it creates a game within a game that we could explore, but that's a dark and deep rabbit hole. So,
no, I mean, I think it's important to call out though, because I think that I've heard a lot of these cases. I've seen it myself as well, where favorism definitely plays a role. And I've seen a lot of people like at larger companies get completely blocked out of a promotion, even though like on paper, like you can be absolutely crushing it. I've actually seen a situation where somebody who was at the bottom of the leaderboard ended up getting a promotion versus like 3 or 4 other people that were top performers. Just because of internal politics, just because, and even tenure wise, like this was somebody who didn't even have tenure anywhere near the other people. And this happens all the time, unfortunately. So I think there's just more, I'll just say bullshit that you have to kind of like navigate. And I personally don't thrive in that. I'm very bad at like doing that stuff. I can do it. I've done it. But I also think like a part of just realizing what you want is figuring out what you don't want. And so, having that brand name recognition, having been somewhere large for a year is still valuable. Again, pros and cons, right? Like there's no perfect track of how you should do this. We're not telling you to like, or we're not laying out like the exact criteria and everything else too, as associated with that. But I think we stop it there, because this is probably an entire pod.
It gets dangerous.
Yeah, in of itself, and there's so many stories that we can talk about there. Maybe let's jump on to the next one, which is onboarding and training. So like the difference in, and I think it's pretty self-intuitive that there's going to be more training, more structure at a large organization versus.
But it doesn't mean better.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't mean better. I'll let you sort of take this one. I'll talk a little bit.
Sure. I think that's the important thing to call out, right? It's why, going back to an earlier point, if this is your first tech sales job and you get an offer from a tier 1 company, call it, 80% of the time, I think that's the right move. The training still is not great. Like, one of the people on our team, Connor, actually works at Oracle, and he, as an SDR manager, kind of rewrote a lot of the SDR training there very effectively, because it's not even that the quality of their content is that bad. Just one of the things that happens at these larger and larger companies is you have these dedicated positions like sales enablement or sales trainer, right? And there are great ones out there, don't get me wrong. But a lot of times at these mass companies where it's bring in a cohort of people, if we have 30% of them here in 2 years, that's a win, and we'll figure it out. They have trainers who haven't sold directly either ever or haven't in like 5-10 years. They have all these people. So the content itself might be good, but the person who hasn't made a cold call in 10 years or the person who's never done it ever is telling you, wow, Chris, that was a great practice cold call. Like, you're going to crush it, no doubt. There are times where I've just seen that training. Like, I think it's still better than a lot of situations, but you need to compartmentalize it. And I think whether it's, attaching to top performers, some of the other things we talk out outside the scope of this video, don't think that just because MongoDB is renowned for training, just because Salesforce is a market leader and basically invented tech sales, right? Just because they have all those resources does not mean they're up to date and great, and does not mean you're going to be a top performer. But you will have more support than potentially startups where they're making it up as they go. And this is another distinction, and I think something that I realized having experience at a large company and interviewing with several startups when I broke in, going back to the point of the manager, I'm not going to over-index it like you should bet your life on the manager, because you never know. You may join this startup and they actually were interviewing elsewhere, and that's actually why they were so upbeat, because they only had 2 months left in the role, right? But for the most part, I think that the training, like, definitely do your diligence, see what they have. But I would say a much heavier portion is going to be reliant on, for lack of a better word, the vibes and the trust that you get from the manager that's going to hire you. And also, ideally, you get a chance to talk to a couple SDRs on the team to kind of vet the talent level, because that's really what's going to set the pace more than anything at these startups. And even though, like, I personally would rather pick like a manager who's really good, who is a great coach, over and very minimal training resources and pre-recorded trainings and 2 months, Oracle's SDR training program that's worked for thousands of reps, like Mark Benioff, who left and started Salesforce. Like, I'm going to bet from a purely training perspective, not saying I would take the job, but over a manager who has the time, who has a team of maybe 5 to 8 people and has designed the training themselves and has a track record of success at the company of attaining themselves, over Oracle, which is just going to sit here, and just say training, market leader since 1980, all of these different things, which are valid, and it's a great company. But those are the types of things I'm thinking of when I'm actually weighing the training into, is this the right situation for me?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, this is another reason why I just prefer smaller companies, to be honest, because more training does not equal better. Actually, I think it's the opposite. Unfortunately, because statistically speaking, the majority of sales enablement teams do not have experience.
Yeah.
And again, critical thinking here, like, you've got to sit down and ask yourself, like, you're not going to ask this during an interview, like, hey, who's your sales enablement person? Does he have sales experience? And you'd be like, what the, like, like, what's going on here? But I think that, like, there's a lot of people that put a lot of emphasis on this, and I don't think that there needs to be a lot of emphasis on this, because I think it's noise, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Like, 95% of the time, more training is just going to confuse you. And you're going to think that because you're going into a large company like, Oracle, Google, AWS, that you're getting this top tier training that's going to absolutely transform. And honestly, like, the optics from other sales leaders, they think that's happening.
Totally.
Which is kind of crazy to me that people think that's the case.
Yeah.
Because it's the opposite.
Yeah.
And so then they end up like they say, hey, you're not following the instructions, Anyway, that's a whole other thing in of itself. But
it speaks to the admin stuff, though. It's like I'll call it out and give it back to you. But like at a large company, there's going to be times where they say, "Hey, we just rolled out this new training. You have to go through it."
Yeah.
And there's 4 to 8 hours of your week where like you have to go through it, and if you don't, you're going to get like demonstrably penalized. So
yeah. So I think just to tighten out on this, like don't make your decision based on training.
Yeah.
I think that should be like the bottom criteria of everything.
Yeah. Make the assumption that you're going to have to figure a lot out still on your own and learn regardless of the environment you're in from top performers.
Yeah.
Don't expect the training to get you there. So, sorry, I said another way. But
No. And that's not a bad thing either, right? Like that's actually where the opportunity is.
Totally.
So anyhow, let's move over to the last one. This one probably a lot more important than people think, like especially when they're first joining tech sales. I don't think people understand the importance of work-life balance.
Yeah.
Is they're always like, I'm so hungry, like I'm willing to put in the work and I'm willing to work like 16, 18-hour days. But when you're just barely getting by working those crazy amount of hours, it gets really tough.
Yeah.
And so, I'm not going to shy away from the fact that like Vanta is extremely hyper competitive. Like it's an environment where you have to work pretty long hours to perform, to crush. There is also like a huge opportunity to make a lot of money, which is awesome.
Yeah.
So like in that sense, at least like you have like you're getting rewarded for the amount of hours that you're putting in, but that is not always the case. A lot of the times when you're going to a smaller startup, because they're growing so fast, they're not as generous with their comp plans. And so they're expecting you to hit these crazy numbers. And you can see huge changes in comp plans as well.
Yeah.
Like, from like it can be perfect. And honestly, what happens is there'll be like a really good comp plan. And then because the company is growing so fast, the executive members are sitting down at the table and saying, hey, if we just get 10 more reps and they sustain this and that, and we spend more money on marketing, like it sounds amazing on paper, right? Like it sounds so great on paper. But there's so many other cogs that play into this where it's like, now if you increase like the amount of spend that you spend on marketing, the average lead that comes in is lower quality, the average conversion rate no longer plays in, blah, 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 blah. Like there's a lot of stuff that happens, but the problem is these companies are then hiring 10 reps, right? And you are not able to sustain those same numbers, and problems arise. Like this is honestly a cycle that hypergrowth companies go through. Even Vanta went through this, like where this was before I joined, but there was hypergrowth, growing very quickly. Obviously, there was a huge need. I see it actually happening. I'm not going to call out the specific companies, but I see a lot of companies right now that are like hiring 20, 30 new reps. And they talk all the time about like how every single team is crushing their number on LinkedIn.
Growth,
yeah. And then ironically enough, like there's this one or two quarters that happen where they went from hitting their number 16 months in a row. Sales leaders are leaving left and right. They're going on to the next thing. And some companies like kind of bounce back. Vanta really did bounce back, which is awesome. But they realized that like, hey, we cannot sustain a team of 20 sellers right now at this stage.
Yeah.
And so, but that's a risk, right? So just pointing that out is like, this is the risk of going with a smaller company, is they don't have this kind of background of figuring these things out. And there's a good chance this is going to happen at some point.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was a lot. So I tackled a lot of it. But
yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's a lot generalization here, but it's certainly a lot easier to not coast in the sense that you're not going to hit your number and stay employed. Like you need to hit your number. But it is a lot easier, typically speaking, at a larger company to kind of fly under the radar. There's less, you're less under a microscope. And I think conversely, said another way, I know you touched on a lot of these things. It's like the startup, the hyper-growth startup kind of becomes this self-reinforcing thing. So if you're doing really well, that's great. And for like 2-3 years, that's very sustainable maybe. But then you've always been number one, you get promoted, leadership sees you as a leader. They want you to either become a manager or an enterprise AE. You've never not hit your number. And now you got there by working 12 to 14-hour days. But now the company's grown so much. It's not even that you're doing anything different. But now the territories are a little bit thinner. Every rep has to squeeze more out of a smaller and smaller territory. And now you're working 12 to 14-hour days to try and figure out how you can get the same result, even though a lot of things outside of your control have changed. So, no perfect answer. But even zooming out, because I know a lot of people watching this are probably breaking in or like considering a change pretty early-ish in their career. Maybe not, but I think like my mindset going into tech sales is like that first year or two, 10 to 12-hour days are kind of a standard. Doesn't mean you have to work the weekends, but I think there's so much value to be learned from learning everything you can. That doesn't mean 10 to 12 hours in the seat, like doing calling and emailing.
Yeah.
It means 8 to 10 hours of a very productive day, and then an extra 2 self-educating. And then enjoy your weekends, maybe a weekend morning here or there to catch up on a little bit of work. But that, I think, don't worry so much about like, okay, I'm going to AWS, so that means it's chill, or I'm going to this startup, so I've just signed my life away. Your first 2 years, 12-hour days, 60-hour weeks, like standard, and just for your own benefit. Not even like saying grind, not even asking you how bad do you want it or any of this stuff, but like that's going to set you up really well. But yeah, you know, just maybe putting a bow on this for now. Like even at my first company, which was a startup, I did those 12-hour days my first 2 years, but by the end of it, I was able to really peel back and have, I don't know, 6-hour days sometimes. And there were some weeks where it was crazy, you know, times where I'm 10 p.m. I'm on the phone with the CTO. There's a time my biggest client had an issue and it's Thanksgiving break and it's, you know, midnight. I'm on the phone in Florida at a buddy's place. Like those things happen, right?
Yeah.
But I think, you know, aside from like generally speaking, hyper growth startup, you're going to make, there's a lot more opportunity, but to tap into that, it's go, 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 go. Whereas the large company, a lot of things change. Your territory, your manager is much more likely to change year over year. And so it still benefits you to work hard. But I've seen situations with peers, with larger companies that I've worked at where the person was deserving of a promotion. But a lot of things change. To your point, like there's these cycles at big tech companies where managers leave kind of all at once and they take a bunch of people with them. And now someone who was a good rep performing, but maybe not the clear number one, gets that promotion, right? Or, you know, the company as a whole puts its emphasis on enterprise deals. And now just because the CRO, I'm not even saying it's a bad decision, but they want to have more enterprise reps. All of a sudden this year, they opened up 50% more headcount on the enterprise team, and they're filling half of that with internal promotions to keep morale high. So there's a lot more ability. It's not a one size fits all answer to chill and still progress. Maybe not make quite as much on these larger companies, but on the small companies, there's absolutely, you know, if you have 3 to 5 years to work at a unicorn, I think do it.
Yeah.
You're going to work your ass off. You're going to be tired of it, but the potential to progress, and also by the time that 5 years eclipses, have your name attached to now like $1 billion plus company, it's there. And do not take that as go to a startup, because there's a lot of dog shit out there. But yeah, I feel like I've talked a ton, so that's
no. I think that's solid. I mean, there's a lot of insight here, and remember that everything is situational. I think if we could map out like the, you know, like the dream scenario, it's go to a larger company, get some name brand recognition, you know, build up your resume. From there, I think you have a lot more visibility and insight into, you know, where to go, how to measure these different things out, because you can listen to YouTube videos and podcasts and different things all day long, but there's still nuances, and we can go on for like, you know, like 10 hours here. Like you don't understand the little nuances, and you also don't know what you want and what you don't want until you've kind of been in there. But I think removing risk early on in your career is a really good thing, because then you give yourself more leeway to jump around. I mean, if you are like, you know, if you're in a prime spot and, you know, like you can join a really, really hot, like hyper growth startup. If you've really done your research, if you're really deep in it, which sure, like some people do that. But I just think the better way to go about this to remove risk, make sure that you're kicking off your tech sales career in a good way. And I think you agree is to go to a more, you know, name brand recognized company. It doesn't have to be the largest company in the world. It doesn't have to be AWS, GCP, or whatever else, but a good company that has some traction, that's not at the risk of like losing all their funding next year and you're screwed and now you have a 6-month stint on your resume, right? So anyhow, I think that would be our personal recommendation, but we have seen people on either side of the spectrum absolutely crush it. Go to a small company, get promoted in like 6, I mean, you did it, right? 3.5 months. So like definitely possible. Definitely can happen. And I think hopefully, like, you know, if you watch through all of this, kudos to you. You kind of understand the nuances of like, why is this a good move? Why is this a bad move? What's best for you? Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we obviously monitor the comments too. So if you're going through it, feel free to comment below. And also we do coach hundreds of students breaking in, almost 1,000 at this point at higherlevels.com. So yeah, this is like, these longer form conversations are very common things we see. You know, people give like one hitter answers on LinkedIn or maybe a 5-minute video on YouTube. And if you're really in the throes of it right now, like trying to break in, considering multiple offers, yeah, hopefully this gave you a lot of perspective. So I don't know if you have anything else for us. But no, I think that was solid.
Awesome.
See you guys in the next one.
See you guys.